So this is a discussion on the concept of archetypes
Yes.
of Carl Jung. So this is part of our series on discussing core ideas of Carl Jung.
Yes.
So today, the format is that we'll go one by one to each of you, and you'll be asking, it's an open-ended question, what are archetypes and what role do they play in an individual psyche? And each person will give their own take, anywhere between 5 to 10 minutes. And once we've done that, then the panelists, each of the panelists get to ask a question of the panel, and anybody can pipe in and talk about it. And then we will open it up to the audience to get questions from the audience. So, what are archetypes? Who would like to go first? Skip, George, John, or Richard? Any preference? Skip, go ahead.
Okay. All right, I'll step up because I'm the least credentialed of everyone here, so everybody can correct me after if I'm wrong. I think of archetypes in two ways. One as dry riverbeds, and one is as platters in a jukebox. And when archetypes are constellated, meaning that psychic energy is contributed into them, then they begin to play. And once they begin to play, they don't stop until they're done. And so it's like a jukebox where once the record gets selected and comes out and starts playing, it's not going to stop until it's done, until it plays all the way through. So the most basic archetype that I can speak to is mother. And there's simply no question that once a woman becomes a mother, she's a mother for the rest of her life. And the mother archetype is very broadly known. And for men, it's the warrior archetype. So I find that if I watch Triumph of the Will, which is Leni Riefenstahl's movie about Adolf Hitler, I find that hearing all those drums and seeing all those marching men, boy, I want to join that outfit. And so the warrior archetype gets constellated in young men, but really it's a archetype that brings you into manhood. So, the U.S. Marines say Marines build men. Well, that's quite true. They actually constellate the warrior in you and make you a man and try to train you to be a responsible man on top of that. But the warrior archetype comes through whether you listen to the training or not. That's the way, those are my simplistic ways of thinking about those two archetypes. So.
Okay. Thank you, Skip. Next up is George, then Richard, and then John. George, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Srinka, once again. Wow. I guess I'll preface by saying, ultimately the archetype is ineffable, yet it's experiential. It's at best elusive. Jung describes the archetypes as these systems of readiness, and that has always resonated with me. Actually, I also want to start by, yesterday my wife and I, we went to the beach, and I just, we both were gazing at the ocean, and just the immense power that the ocean possesses. For me, it was a wonderful allusion to the collective unconscious. It's not so strange. It's a perennial metaphor, in literature, and Jung points to it as well. It's the potency of those waves, the potency of those forces. What's the genesis of those forces? I guess one can get empirical and rationalistic about it, but ultimately, as an experience, I don't think one can localize or kind of discern the aspects of those forces. And I think archetypes are in the same way. These psychic forces that are difficult to at best, we can become descriptive. You know, we can describe them, but we can't really measure them or define them. Yet we experience them, you know, through their impact. Anyway, getting back to archetypes, I think they're quite implicit in the way that they relate to us. They're quite dynamic. You know, Jung, I believe, describes them as the, you know, the denizens of the collective unconscious. And as Skip said, depending how they're constellated, the way they're organized, giving a particular epoch, giving a particular individual's narrative, they inform egoic, you know, ego consciousness. Usually, I think indirectly. I suspect some of us, giving the fortitude of one's ego, you can have direct experience. But I think that's quite rare, and I think one runs a risk when that occurs. Okay, that's enough for my description of archetype.
Sure. Okay, next up is Richard. Richard, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm just, back again. So yeah, I'm just a bit pooped after the whole talking for an hour and a half, but I'll try. So I did go through a bit of this in my slides, but, you know, so an archetype, you know, is a qualitative aspect of the system of the mind that we all share through whatever process, evolution. You know, it's in there since, I love John's earlier, since the earliest turtle, since the first turtle, or even before, since the first amoeba or the first whatever, I don't know. You know, it's something that has like come through that pathway that connects us through that pathway. And so that we've ended up with, you know, in the same way we've physically got a body which has the same kind of form to it, we've got a mind system that has the same kind of form, the same kind of structural elements to it. And you know, an archetype is just a way of characterizing a qualitative aspect of that system that we all share in common. And therefore you find that the archetype gets expressed through projection in art and culture and many different forms in sort of different concrete ways, but they've all got the same specific theme or qualitative nature to them. And that's what makes it the archetype. Another interesting thing, I think it was Jung talked about the crystallographic axial system. So he's talking about chemistry, right? He's talking about like when you've got some solution of a chemical and then you kind of cool it and then it forms into crystals. I mean, like obviously water does when you freeze it and you get like, you can have snowflakes or whatever kind of, you can have a form that comes out of that. And it's like, there's something in that liquid form before that kind of is almost pre-programmed that when you cool it, it is going to do this thing and form certain types of, or very roughly certain sided types of crystals, for instance. He's saying that's a bit like archetypes in that there's something there which gives form to how things will be. And it's quite abstract. You know, obviously a chemist could go, oh, well, we've got these covalent bonds and these electron orbitals and stuff, and they'll find some way of describing why it is. But you know, there'll be some reason why the mind has these things as well. It's just we don't know what they are. So we just say, right, well, these are archetypal qualities, and we have them, and they're there. And we know they're there because people seem to express the same themes again. And as we've described from John's model, you know, by mindfully watching these aspects of the mind arising in real time in ourselves, we can start to notice the archetypal qualities playing out in actual real time, but as complex as and with their functional attachment. So, yeah, they can be very real things right under your nose when you get sucked into some kind of mode of being that is unconscious and playing it out in a relationship, in an argument or something, gripped by an archetypal aspect, and you become a different kind of person. You become a different kind of aspect or part of yourself that is not, that's got a certain distinct character, but is not typically how you are when you're consciously acting. That's how you can really recognize an archetypal aspect of yourself, you know. So there you go.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Richard. So John, what are archetypes and how how do they operate in an individual psyche?
Well, Jung used the word archetype for the first time, we think, in 1919. Before that, he had used the term primordial image. So the term archetype, as Jung uses it, is 101 years old. But you can certainly find the term archetype in St. Augustine, for example, and it was it implied in the philosophy of Plato with the famous forms, but the way it comes, it has always seemed to me, since I've engaged with this, is that archetypes have something to do with survival, and they also are what survive the vicissitudes of individual experience over generations of time, so that they are by nature intergenerational accretions of the perception of something that I can only formulate in religious terms. That if you live long enough and you watch the pattern of history, it's very clear that although we have the fantasy that everything is up to persons and their agencies, and we love to create religious models that God is looking after persons, whoever God is or whatever God is, however one wants to define it, that the organizing power of the universe, we would like to believe that it's a respecter of persons, but history teaches us that God is not a respecter of persons, but God is a respecter of situations. And so it behooves us to understand situations. And unfortunately, we have to develop patterns of behavior that suit the situations in which we find ourselves, or we will perish. Right now, we have a situation on our hands, and we're trying to find a pattern of behavior the only way we're going to get out of this particular situation we're in now is if we develop an image of it. Now, I don't think we have an image currently of the situation we're currently in around the world. That the scientists keep trying to give us models, and it was so obvious with their models, which keep turning out to be wrong in different ways, that no one has an image of the situation. So sooner or later will emerge an image of this situation, and it will turn out to draw upon an awareness that this situation has happened before. And that image will be an archetypal image. It's sort of, we steer by archetypal images, but the images are actually images of a situation that give us both an image of the situation and of the pattern of behavior appropriate to that, which requires that we take up a certain role. So you have a pattern, you have a situation, a pattern of behavior that might enhance survival in that situation, and an archetypal role. Now, unfortunately, Western culture has gotten all hung up on the archetype of the hero, so that after a while, if you read the early work of Joseph Campbell, you think the hero is the only archetype. And I think what makes Jung so interesting is that he recognized that was the problem with Freud, that he only had one archetype, and the Oedipus archetype, and that was basically a variant of the hero archetype. And showed some of the limitations of the hero archetype. But when Jung realized that was going to be the only one, he left. And Freud was so hurt by the way in which Jung left that he did add another archetype, and that was Narcissus, who got projected onto Jung. So Jung was the narcissistic character, and so he had two archetypes now, the Oedipus and but Jung opened the door to the fact that there's so many situations, and there's there's a pattern of behavior and an image that belongs to that situation. Now, about 10 years after Jung came to the idea of archetype, he wrote his preface to the psychological commentary on The Secret of the Golden Flower, which had been published, but which had been translated by Richard Wilhelm, whom Jung met in around 1924, somewhere between 1919 and 1929. So 5 years after he had the archetype, he met Richard Wilhelm, who was the translator of the I Ching, which has 64 situations that are described as hexagrams with nuances of each, because hexagrams are 6 line figures that are either yang or yin that are built up into a very remarkable system, Chinese system of geomancy. The geomancy of the West had 16 diagrams. The geomancy of the East, the I Ching, has 64. And these 64 situations describe situations in which people find themselves, specifies aspects, and prescribes various patterns of behavior appropriate to each situation, and mentions historical figures in those roles. That, to me, is about as good an archetypal model as we'll ever get. And Jung did say he got more from Richard Wilhelm than any other man, because Richard Wilhelm was working out exactly what Jung was working out with his translation of the I Ching. They were both born in the same year, practically, 1875. So they were extraordinarily interesting friends. And I believe Wilhelm to be an extroverted intuitive, where Jung was an introverted intuitive. So as an extroverted intuitive, when I think of archetypes, I think people have been in situations which require them to survive and take on certain roles. And the archetype provides, as you say, the riverbed that, when irrigated, provides a way of seeing how this situation has been handled in the past, the role taken up in it, and whether it's appropriate. So when you get to my mother and Barbara Streisand, you have a very interesting issue. My mother was born in the South, and her father abandoned the family because she was a girl, basically, within 18 months of her birth. So my grandmother had to sort of work and babysit my mother. So she put my mother in the movies all the time. And so my mother grew up in schools, sometimes separated from her mother, and with who she was around her mother was usually in the movies. So when she was 10 years old, she was called Baby Garbo. That would be in 1928. And then in the 40s, she was said to be more, people often compared her to Rita Hayworth. And in the 50s, she was taken by taxi drivers in New York to be Grace Kelly. So my mother grew up with a certain model of being a movie star that represented what it would take for a baby to get her mother's attention. And so she became this very glamorous person with a tremendous social persona and a very empty self in many ways behind it. And so when I took up Barbara Streisand, who challenged the pretty model of movie star that Garbo and Rita Hayworth had meant, I was also trying to find an alternative to being the nonstop mirror for my mother, and that I wouldn't have to just keep on being the beautiful son to the beautiful mother, because I'd already had a shocking experience. I'd taken my mother to see the World's Fair in New York when I in the year I believe it was roughly 1964. I'm trying to remember exactly. It might have been a little bit earlier, maybe 62 or 63. There was an expo in New York. I was quite young at the time, 23 or 24. And they had the Pietà on display. The Pietà was on display. And that would be all the way from the Vatican. They brought Michelangelo, and there was this beautiful young mother, Mary, with still beautiful, still young, even though she was the mother of Jesus, she did not look like an older woman. She looked like a very young woman. And she had the dead body of Jesus in her arms. And as soon as my mother saw that, her eyes welled up with tears and she began to cry. And I had a sense of absolute horror, because I realized that that was exactly what was in store for me if I continued with that mother complex, that dread impersonal pattern, as von Franz talks about it, in which the mother and the son are together, and the son, the mother becomes a widow to the dead son. Now, I was born in 1939, and my generation had a bumper crop of young men who were puerperternus, who fell off mountaintops or died of AIDS or in Vietnam or committed suicide. It's astonishing how many people of my generation came a cropper to the heroic fantasies of their parents when they lived them out. So I knew that I was a goner if I stayed in that archetype. So I had to find for myself, and my psyche offered me another model. And the first one it offered me was the Barbra Streisand challenge to the pretty style of Garbo and Hayworth and Kelly, and was just as much a star. And so I realized that I did not have to be only a mother pleaser. That was a huge thing for me at that particular time, to be able to go from one archetype to another. Now, in fact, the archetype I went to was not necessarily the better archetype for me. In fact, I later came to the Chinese laundress, but it was a step in the process. So can you see that we work in situations that people have faced again and again, and we have to figure out a pattern of behavior that is appropriate to that situation, and it's a struggle. And each time that we get an image of the situation, there's a constellation of life events that match that image. We form it, and then our unconscious offers us other models when that model isn't quite right, but they are still archetypal models. So we ricochet from archetype to archetype until we finally find a set of archetypes that actually work for us in a pragmatic way. So that's why I created this system, so that people could find their way, so that perhaps they could find roles that are actually work for their development, rather than just get stuck in some corner constantly reiterating one archetype. But the energy for them, the basis of them, is this strange ability of the self to organize itself through a series of archetypal images that gives us a check of balances and a kind of potential democracy inside, where we actually can have a choice in how we live, rather than simply be under the compulsion of the stars and just have to live out the dread impersonal patterns that so frequently, as the Greek myths tell us, have tragic endings. So if that gives you what I mean about archetypes, I hope that's clear.
Wow, that was amazing. That was amazing. Thank you. Now the panel gets to ask, each person in the panel gets to ask a question to the panel. So who would like to go first? And then folks, in the last session, we didn't have much time for Q&A from the audience, but this time we're going to have plenty of time for that. So please go ahead and type in your questions in the chat, okay? And we will come to them. So who would like to Skip, go ahead.
I'm especially interested in the others' answer to this question. We've been having the hero's journey, so-called, crammed down our throats ever since Star Wars.
Yes.
And it occurred to me, if we go to Star Wars 4, which was actually the first movie, Luke Skywalker at the end is coming into this great auditorium with a throng of people all lined up in military fashion. and he's getting this award. So obviously he's completed becoming a hero. And it occurs to me that this hero's journey that he went through in Star Wars 1, and it's sort of repeated over and over again throughout the series, is actually the task of a young person in the first half of life. I mean, the way I have said it is that when we're infants, we're actually wild animals, and we have to learn how to be human beings from our parents and then from our schooling. And so we have to learn what the ropes are, the rules of the game. And that's the hero's journey, is learning the rules and maybe making some achievement, whether it's becoming a lawyer or becoming a psychoanalyst or what have you. But that's actually the end of the hero's journey when you achieve that. And then there's the second half of life journey, which is really Dr. Jung's journey, what he was interested in. And so the hero's journey is only half the story, in my opinion, and it keeps getting jammed down our throats as the primary story of life. I wonder if you'd comment on that, John.
Well, you know, it's very hard to get a good developmental model that helps us understand Jungian psychology and what works at what time. I do believe that, and this is maybe important to say, that the psychological type of the person and that unique pattern of that person's unfolding, but especially the specific fingerprint that isn't exclusively the type, but it certainly includes the type. I think the psychological type of the child is already established in utero by the time the child is 6 or 8 months of age, somewhere in that period. So that I actually feel that if one is naturally going to have a preference for introverted feeling, which means that one is constantly going to check the feeling that's around against an archetypal sense of the feeling that ought to be around, which is what I think an introverted function does, and especially the introverted feeling function, that if that child in utero, that fetus, hears through the abdominal wall the parents arguing in a way that does not accord with the way the archetype of the family is hardwired to be, and is therefore they can feel, as introverted feeling people do, the enormous discrepancy between what's actually happening at a feeling level and what ought to happen from the archetypal level, that child will be born and emerge and be held by the nurse up to the mother in that operating room, that noisy, unpleasant operating room with the too brightly light, but because of the feeling sadness already experienced about the discrepancy, that child will appear with a frown on its face rather than a smile. And it takes quite a family not to try to turn that frown, which is appropriate, into a smile which is inappropriate, as the child has to grow up in a truly dysfunctional family before that family realizes that they're very unhappy and gets their divorce. So that inability of families to accept the type of their child is so consistent that it's not surprising that therapists like myself have to enable people to undo the damage done by the Faustian bargain we all make by the time we're about 2 or 3 years old, which is to start adjusting our type to match the expectation of the family that wants us to see them and be a certain way. So my point is that we have a type, we have a self to begin with. As Jung says, we're not born tabula rasa as we assume. We come into the world with a personality. And we have, that personality is already having self-experience even as far back as in utero. And then we have to grow an ego that can contain the self-experience. And our families either help us or don't help us. Along the way of growing that ego is to draw upon the hero archetype. But that doesn't really take place right away. We start, the business of babies is being loved. We start by trying to get ourselves loved, and then we, at a certain point, have the normal trickster stage of the terrible twos, where we're not only trying to please, but to test authority. It's really only around 4 or 5 that the hero archetype really begins to emerge. And it's only until about 12 or 16 that the hero begins to be the basis of an ego that seeks its own identity, what Erikson calls the identity crisis. But by age 16, one might have an ego identity and a rather strong heroic desire to now take matters into our own hands. And at that point, many of us can survive even the most difficult of original upbringings. I certainly had a very strong hero at the age of 16 years old, and I took command of my own life and really began to define my direction against both my parents, and that even involved financially. I worked my way through college and borrowed money from other people than my parents to get through medical school, because there was no, and I did all that myself. I was so angry at their quarrels that I didn't want to have anything to do with either of them and their quarrels about money. So I did the whole thing myself, found ways of doing it. And that, I had a very strong hero archetype. What I had to learn was that being a strong hero is not necessarily being a very complete or useful person. And that's where getting past the hero and getting past the strong identity and being to make room for other people and listen to other people. And that's where my development of the anima and the introverted sensation and my interest in psychological types came with a pace, with trying to find other people and not just insist on myself all the time, and actually experience what it's like to be related to others. And I would say that became, for me, far more important than that original hero's journey, which I was quite successful given the upbringing I had in getting where I got. But that doesn't prove a thing about my worth as a person. And in fact, the hero has done more damage to the earth than anything else. So there we are in that wonderful paradox that Jung faced at 40.
I'd just like to confirm your story about in utero, because when my first daughter was born, or was to be born, she was 6 months along, I took her mother to see Alexander Nevsky at the Eastman School of Music in Rochester. And it's quite a bombastic piece, as you might know. And during that performance, my daughter started to rattle around, and in 2 to 3 weeks she was born. So she was born 10 weeks early. And so definitely she was forming at that time in utero. And the other comment I wanted to point out was that when the nightclub bombing occurred in Paris several years ago, Anderson Cooper was in Paris, and he was interviewing older Muslim men in Paris and saying, why are these kids going off to fight with ISIS? And they said very simply to him, because they have no other way to prove that they're men. And they were referring to the fact that in Paris, many of these Muslim men are living in poverty, and they don't have a way to go out and actually constellate and begin the hero's journey. And so that's why they were going off to do that. Just an observation.
Thank you. George or Richard, would you like to raise any question for the panel? Nope. Okay. John, would you like to raise a question for the panel?
I'd like to raise the question of how do we get to hear the stories that let us identify the archetypes? That you mentioned Anderson Cooper getting that little bit of insight into why they were doing this. Who else could have asked that question? Here he was, a Vanderbilt. His mother had been Gloria Vanderbilt, very famous. She was married for a while to Stokowski, very, very famous, eternal girl of her time. Brother commits suicide. He was an indifferent student. He didn't go to one of the great schools. He was gay. He's become the Walter Cronkite of our generation, and he just became a father. And the most moving thing you will ever see is Anderson Cooper introducing his son as a single gay father, talking about the surrogate mother and her family, and what he feels about this child and what it's meant to him. Of all the people in the world, it was Anderson Cooper who asked that question and got more insight into the matter. So what it is in us and our own development, and out of our wounds and our overcompensations and our strugglings, enables us to be in that favored position when suddenly some other archetypal reality is able to be disclosed to us that's meaningful to the other that we're trying to understand with our question mark. Seems to me that's the great miracle that we can ever get beyond our own journey, or the other way around, that our own journey gets us to the point that other people's stories somehow can enter our own. To me, that is the miracle right there, and it's what we're doing here. How can we bring our stories in relation to each other, and what is it that enables us to hear them? How did Jung meet Richard Wilhelm at just the point he did? It's those things are very important to me, and I think they in there we have maybe the future of the world is if that wonderful moment at which our self's journey becomes an openness to other journeys that are both similar and different. That seems to me a magical moment. Most of the time, so that out of that would come the question everyone's going to ask: how are we going to get together with an image of what we're going through right now? I think we just have to listen to each other and see what each other is coming up with.
Would any of the other panelists like to comment? Oh, okay, actually, let me ask. There is somebody who asked.
I guess just as a response, briefly, if I understood you, John, correctly, I think that's one of the values of analytical psychology. It doesn't address the riddles of individual development, but it addresses the riddles of the development of the collective, particularly of collective consciousness. And I think in particular, I think you're pointing to how can we, as we figure who we are existentially, how do I participate in a responsible manner within a community? And I'm not sure if again, this is my response to how I understood your comments, and I think that's a very practical question. It's not about our own development, but simultaneously, it's about trying to figure out how we relate to collective consciousness in some manner, simultaneously.
There is a question from the audience related to that. So let's start with the questions from the audience. Folks, It's very simple. We've used these rules before. When you have a question, go ahead and type in your question. That's number one. Number two, keep on topic. Number three, be brief. And number four, feel free to disagree with anything anybody says, but do so courteously. So it's going to be Randy, Gib, M. Johnson, Sanjay, Jan, and Maya next. Randy, go ahead.
Yeah, John Beebe, I wanted to ask, how can we search for the myths and the images to help us out of this current situation, our COVID pandemic? And how do we go about that search? How can we go on the quest to find the myths and the images?
I do have a conversation that I had not long ago online that you can find on an interview series called Breakfast at Kusnacht, which is done by Stefano Carpani. And I'm one of a number of Jungian analysts he interviewed on this very subject. And you will, if you Google Beebe and use the word compensation, and then perhaps his name, Carpani, C-A-R-P-A-N-E, excuse me, C-A-R-P-A-N-I. It's an Italian name. He's a Jungian analyst who's actually living in Berlin, but he's originally Italian. And he speaks English, and so he interviewed me. And what I said at that time was that we're experiencing a violent compensation from nature right now. And I point out in that interview that, and this is something I get from Jung, that nature is not intrinsically kind. So this compensation is not just deserving comeuppance or whatever you might want to put it, or the last judgment. I don't think any of those things quite work. Don't want to, this is not only good, but it is the way nature works. Nature works through compensation, and our dreams are nature, and our dreams compensate our conscious attitudes, and also biologically. And I mentioned in this interview that the tubercle bacillus, when it attacks the lung will react with an enormous reaction to the presence of an invader by developing these terrible tubercles which wall off the virus, but the tubercles that wall off the virus actually close the alveoli of the lung, so that the compensation does more damage perhaps than the original invading bacillus might. So violent compensations occur from time to time when nature is sufficiently out of balance. Anyone who's lived in the world in the last several years can say that it was a period of continuous anxiety and depression and upset, that everything seemed out of balance, and you could feel that it was out of balance. And one probed it daily to see what could be done about it, from dissent to impeachment to whatever. That's just taking our own narrow political focus, but it also relates to the political problems all over the world. I myself was seeing dreams of the feminine. I felt like I was back in 1970 when people were first talking about, in our culture at large, the forgotten feminine. I thought I was at the beginnings of my whole experience of Jungian analysis. Dreams of feminine figures from people all over the world that were damaged and in suffering and so forth. So in a way, it was no surprise that something happened, that sooner or later that the imbalance in the ecosystem and the political ecosystem, I mean, you could make up your own story for it, but when I talk to people, as I do in China, many, many, many people in China, they lost their businesses when Trump started the trade war and put on the tariffs and this and that and reconstructed. So a lot of Chinese businesses when I first went back to China, I was there as a child. I didn't mention that, but when I went back 50 years later as an adult to be a Jungian analyst teaching in China, I saw lots of people still in Shanghai selling on the street and selling very well. By the time in 2006, these people had shops and were moving in. Well, it's not hard to imagine that after the trade war began, there we were back with people who didn't have businesses. They're back in selling on the street. So it doesn't surprise me that bad meat was sold that was infected with bats in the markets in Wuhan. I mean, you don't have to make up a ridiculous conspiracy theory about a lab and the mad scientists and all that, as people love to do. The ecosystem had been thrown out of balance by this excessively heroic president. And so when the hero intervenes in that reckless way, it's not for nothing that the Lancet magazine, the leading medical journal in the world, condemned the way that Trump has been handling this crisis and called for a new American president. That's quite a remarkable thing for a leading medical journal to say, but it's what any good doctor would notice. Every good doctor that I know could tell that we were living in an agitated universe. And when you agitate the universe, troubles sooner or later emerge. So some bad meat got sold, and the bat virus has gone around the world. Now, I don't think that's fair, and I don't think, I mean, Trump will try to blame China, and you could hear me wrongly as trying to blame Trump. It's not as simple as that. I'm saying that when ecosystems go out of balance, the compensations are violent and they're not kind. So we have to so I think the first step is to recognize the compensatory nature of the whole system. I mean, a mother like mine got a son who dreamed about Barbra Streisand. That's compensation. Compensation works that way. Was it fair? Should there have been a long estrangement with my mother? Did that further hurting of her life? Compensations are not kind. They're not fair, and they bring up archetypes are ruthless. So we're in the grip of some kind of archetypal compensation. And what I find helpful in this time, and I say this in that interview, what helps me the most is to let my insomnia speak to me. It takes me about 2 or 3 hours every night when I wake up. I just have to sit and reflect. And I find if I do, I don't miss the sleep. I have all the energy I need to deal with my patients, hold myself, and do things like I'm doing right now. Because it comes from taking the time to shelter at home and use that time to think and reflect. And the fact that we can't even stop for 2 months without the entire economy going out of balance says something about how we've been living. And it says something about why it's unsustainable. So I think we're being asked in some extraordinary way, and this is type talk, to get out of extroverted mania and the mania to master things in an extroverted way by growing economies and renewed national aggression, and instead have the courage to introvert. And introversion is often just sitting with something and seeing what bubbles up. And I think as we introvert and we watch the world immediately go back into Tao, the ozone hole has shrunk. That they can't prove that it's related, but it's the most beautiful spring I've ever seen. The skies are clear. Now, I don't want to romanticize this. Obviously, business has to start again. People are losing jobs. People are being hurt. It's a violent, painful compensation, but it's a call to introversion. So let's just take our simple type model. Any model that doesn't allow us to live both the extroverted and the introverted parts of our lives, it tries to turn it all into extroversion. Any social model is itself going to create a virus of some kind. And I think our only possible cure is to accept the compensation in the direction of opening up our introverted side again. And there might lie our introverted feeling. There might lie our empathy for each other in a new way. And it isn't just, politically correct extroverted feeling. It's something much deeper. That might heal us. So I feel as a doctor, the chance for a healing of the world, but it's a radical re-embrace of introversion. So I hope that if you do anything as type people, that you will realize that introversion matters. I mean, if you can do nothing but that, you've already done the biggest part of what Jung did, because they keep trying to make introversion a disease. Psychiatry has been trying to make introversion a disease. Jung rescued the introverted attitude and showed that it could be, literally, as the film says, a matter of heart. That introverted feeling, as Richard could say, could be more empathic than appreciative extroverted feeling. That's a remarkable thought. And it seems to me that this is a chance, it seems to me, for introverted feeling to get its hearing. If we do that, I don't think we're going to be setting ourselves up for a second round of violent conflict. That's the thesis right now.
Thank you.
It's not this, it's the second round. And we can stop that if we go with the flow.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Next up is Gib. Gib, go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Beebe. You may remember me from the long primordial passive prof type many years ago.
Yes, Gib, I do remember you, and I'm happy to see you again.
It's good to see you face to face and talk with you face to face. So a question I had for you as someone like in HR and who coaches people, there's always a question of how do you introduce type and when do you introduce certain things. So what benefits do you think people get from your 8-function and archetypal model when they're uncertain of their own type? And then related to that, what ages do you think are the easiest and hardest to type for someone to type themselves?
Well, the answer is, whenever you think you have your type, try to think what Richard was saying in his original presentation. What role are you in when you're using that type of consciousness? So that I hope you have noticed that I use introverted thinking to teach, foster ideas. And by the way, the other big discovery I made is that the auxiliary function is not just an auxiliary ego. It's not just a second ego, like a second motor on a plane in case the first kicks out. It's completely different in aim because it's carried by the father or mother archetype, essentially. It is the part of us that is fatherly or motherly, or the part of us that fosters, nurtures, and supports. And so just as our right hand, if we're right-handed, is used to lend support, so our auxiliary function is auxiliary to others. It serves to be an aid to others. The interesting thing is that most of us cannot use the auxiliary function to take care of ourselves. Please don't think I can think for myself the way I can think for you all. I can't. And many of people who have auxiliary extroverted feeling can take care of everybody else with it but themselves. So you have to know what archetypal role is when you're using that. So if someone shows abundant extroverted feeling or abundant introverted thinking, as I may show abundant introverted thinking in teaching and to take care of other people, and I'm in that role, it's very unlikely to be my dominant function, and I would be terribly mischaracterized to be called an introverted thinking type. I use the introverted thinking type in a particular role so that you may or may not be able to identify a heroic function. Not everybody has been successful and or wants to be in being heroic. But as you begin to look at the roles in which you play the parts, it gets pretty clear what's auxiliary, what's dominant, what's tertiary, which is the child, and which is the inferior function carried by the anima or the animus, and which is the opposing personality. So that gradually, if you always ask yourself what role you play the types in, the rest will sort itself out. But if you try to get the type separate from the role, you usually will get the type wrong. That's been my experience.
Thank you. Next question up is from M. Johnson. M. Johnson, go ahead.
I really appreciate what you've been saying. I like your political take, but my question is about the functions themselves.
Sure.
In the 8 functions, anima and animus and the imposing personality are not personifications like the other 6. Is there a reason for this? Are they in some way a different level, more general, more applicable across the whole area or something? Why are they not personified in the way the other 6 are?
You mean, why don't I use personified words?
Well, yeah, I mean,
because to me they are absolutely personified. I mean, to me the anima and the animus are quite definitely personified, and I have spent, if you read James Hillman's book on the anima, the archetype of a personified notion, he gives a perfectly beautiful analysis of every single reference Jung makes to the anima, and he develops it as a personification ultimately of the reflective instinct. And I think that he does a beautiful job with that. So I think the job is done. Now, I have tried in my writings to personify and in storytelling that I do to do my teaching, to personify the opposing personality. Certainly to today, I taught it entirely in terms of Barbara Streisand, for instance. That's personification. So I grant that in my language, I say opposing personality, but the very fact that I use the word personality implies that it is a personage, a personality. That's what I meant. I meant that it is a personality, and often a very dramatically interesting personality. So for me, they are personified, but I wonder if there's some way in which I talk about them that doesn't immediately summon that, and I think that's what you're telling me. Okay. I'm using traditional words. For me, the anima and the animus are persons in the psyche, and I get that from my Jungian background. But this may be a failure of my my extroverted sensation, for example, to give those two places the same immediate. There must be some way in which I'm not getting that across. I'm not really touching your mind with the persons in those places. And if so, the limitation comes from me. The limitation's mine.
Next question is from Sanjay. Sanjay, go ahead.
Yes. So, Dr. Beebe, you described, you explained that throughout life we constantly redevelop our primary archetype. So will the new archetypes always be better? What about problems in a psyche that thwarts improvement, for example, in a narcissist archetype? And are you saying that each new archetype is better because a healthy mind always heals itself?
Well, we select archetypes for various reasons. Sometimes cultures tell us that we ought to select those archetypes, or leaders tell us, or our parents tell us, so that, obviously Skip was brought up to feel that being a man, you almost had to have a warrior archetype. I mean, that was how you were taught. I mean, somehow the great initiation was military service, and the military, so the sports hero, that somehow the idea that one would somehow to be able to do battle with the world is somehow intrinsic to masculinity.
Well, yeah, even Vietnam War protesters were
they were
manifesting
warriors, exactly.
Yeah, sure.
So, but in my model, in my mind, whenever I see either an individual or a culture insisting on an archetype, then I ask myself, well, part of me just naturally says, who says? But the other is, I guess I follow William James in being pragmatic. I mean, I'm very pragmatic in my mind. And so for me, well, that's great, but how well has that actually worked out for you? And being a warrior didn't work out that well for my father. He was so combative when he was a military officer that they kept him out of military duty and pushed him in intelligence because they didn't trust him in the theaters of war in World War II. Later, he became a battalion commander in Korea, and he said that the thing he learned was not to be so combative. When he was too combative, he couldn't even get into combat. And that was a great disappointment to him in World War II. And so that kind of, so we have the irony, does the archetype that we've been taught to use, and it seems to be appropriate to the situation we're in, does it actually work? Here was my father, an Army officer who was too combative, and he didn't get promoted to major and general until he learned to be less combative, which is a very interesting phenomenon.
Well, which is quite true, though, because I know from 23 years in the Marine Corps to Lieutenant Colonel that I only knew one person, Lieutenant Colonel or above, who was that stereotype that you're talking about, the stereotype of the hard charging, charge the hill Marine. I only knew one that made it to Lieutenant Colonel.
Exactly. So the key here, it seems to me, is step one is noticing the archetype you're caught in and ask yourself if you are able, try to step back from it and reflect on it. And one of the questions you have to ask yourself, well, I'll take a line from a movie with Alice Faye, in which a man is coming up to her behaving as he thinks a man should behave toward a woman, and Alice Faye looks at him after he finishes and says, "Are you getting anywhere with that line?" I never forgot that, and I feel that's what I want to have everyone do. I mean, most of us overuse some archetype that we thought would work, and often as we notice that it's driving people away rather than bringing them closer to us, we might step back and reflect on, is that archetype that I'm identified with and have been taught is the only way to be really getting me anywhere? Is it working? Is it working in the world? Is it working for me?
Yeah, the question is, though, are you playing? Yeah.
If we look at our dreams, they're criticizing us all the time and offering us other archetypal models. And the question is, are we willing to listen to them? Are we going to stay in the same archetype?
I think the question is, are you play acting or are you actually performing? I mean, George C. Scott in the opening to Patton gives the Patton great speech where he says, when you put your hand into a bunch of goo that a moment before was your best friend's face, you'll know what to do. Okay, that's the constellation of the warrior archetype right there. Has nothing to do with whether you're a handsome in your dress uniform or anything like that. It has to do with the constellation of an archetype that's going to tell you to perform in exactly this way.
Well, yeah, the archetype will always want you to behave a certain way, but you've also been led into that archetype. And there's also some part of you that's being influenced to take it up. But you're quite right. It is a compulsive pattern of behavior. But we also have the capacity to reflect. And that's where the anima and the animus come in. We can step back from ourselves, and we can, above all, listen to our dreams, which are constantly showing us whether the archetypes we're in are working for us or not, and offering other alternatives. Befriending those other alternatives, listening to the criticism that comes from the dreams, enables us, the only chance I know that we really get to critique our act. Others will, of course, try to tell us. And sometimes those other people can influence us. Mostly, we don't listen to the others that see so clearly where we're one-sided, but we will listen if it comes up from inside ourselves. If from inside myself, I get the message I'm one-sided, then that would come back to what Richard said, then I have a chance. And the 8-function model opens up the possibility that there are quite a number of roles we can play in life, and any one of them might be the appropriate one in a given time.
Sure.
Excellent.
Not just one.
Thank you. I'm going to take a question which is related to this from Ukami Sharper. Steve, go ahead. Steve.
Hey guys.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, John Beebe. This has been one of the greatest Jungian conversations I've ever had the pleasure of listening to. Thank you to the rest of the panel. So perhaps in a bit of synchronicity, I just happened to wear a Legend of Zelda shirt today, which
I'm noticing.
you know, the protagonist is named Link, but the series is named after the princess that he consistently saves. So I tend to think that Zelda is a representation of Link's anima. So my question is about the balance between the hero archetype, which Link always kind of sought to personify, and the anima. So I kind of identify two energies in contemporary American society. One in which, and I used the example in the chat, that recently I think we've kind of been asking our young boys to consider consent in their relationships with other people, which I think is a positive step.
Yes,
But,
I would say so.
you know, I find it peculiar that only boys are taught to think about consent at a young age, which is obviously a response to their disproportionate role older, when they get older in life, to engaging in relationships without consent. But at the same time, I see that as kind of an anima concession to the other people in society to be more considerate. And I see an opposite energy in the form of an almost tyrannical heroism, in which the male is asked to be so callous that it puts other people at risk and in danger. And I think that is an archetypical danger of a young man that hasn't tempered his hero archetype well. And the example I gave in the chat was our leaders appearing in public consistently without masks, which we know is something that we dawn in this era, not only for our own safety, but the safety of others. So I want to know, what do you think are the prospects for Western civilization's ability to find a balance between a young man's hero and anima? Because as you stated earlier, out of control heroism has put the entire human race in danger. So I think if we're going to, as a species, come out of this century well, we're going to have to find a way for young men to find a healthy balance between those two energies. So what do you think are the prospects, and what do you think are some of the methodologies for pursuing those prospects?
You're touching a very deep chord in my soul. I had a wonderful Jungian analyst for about almost 25 years in all, maybe 23 years in all, Joseph Henderson, who was a person who had been analyzed around 1929-30 by Jung himself, and was present in Zurich at that early period, and then later helped found the Jung Institute of San Francisco. Our Jung Institute of San Francisco is the only Jungian institute or training program in the entire world that did not have a split not too long after it was founded. And I think the reason was partly because of the several people who founded it. Dr. Henderson was the only one who did not have a heroic attitude that insisted upon his own dominant perspective. The usual rule was that someone at the top was an introverted intuitive, often with extroverted thinking, who was rather like Jung, who tried to insist that everybody else who studied Jungian psychology would do analysis, practice analysis, and think like an introverted intuitive with extroverted thinking. Needless to say, other people of other types sooner or later rebelled against that tightness. So I was once at a lecture that Dr. Henderson was, in fact, it's the lecture that made me decide to go into analysis with him, that I heard him talking to a man in the audience. He'd given a lecture on his thesis. One of his big themes was initiation, which is a process that takes us beyond the hero to a more humble thing called the initiate. This goes for women too. The novel A Passage to India is about a woman with a heroic attitude who finally realizes that she cannot be certain of what she thinks she's so sure of. And in fact, in that case, she's sure that a man made a pass at her while they were in a cave together, and then where there was an echo. And later she had to admit that she was so disoriented by the echo that although she brought charges against the man for making a pass on her, that she might actually be wrong. And she has to admit in court that she isn't sure what happened, at which point the man got off. And that moment in which this particular heroine discovers that she has to get beyond the hero in herself and question whether she really knows what happened. It was a great moment in this novel. Now, usually the problem in our culture is the men have to get over being the hero. In this case, in this 1924 novel by E.M. Forster, it was a woman who had taken on a heroine position and been the accuser who had to get past the heroine position. Getting past so what I heard Dr. Henderson in relation to a question say to one of the people in the audience, he heard the question, which was not unlike your question, and he said back, well, can you see how hard it is to get beyond the hero? And when I heard that, it just hit a chord in me. And I decided that I would work with this man. It was a very important decision that I made to decide that, yeah, I can be heroic and I can get a lot of things done, but it is not going to make me happy to stay in the hero. So, and it's not going to make me the kind of person I really want to be. So between Forster's novel and that moment which I read in college, and that moment hearing Dr. Henderson, I learned that there's a developmental sequence which is no less masculine or no less empowering. And I believe that Forster's point in A Passage to India is that it's no less feminine and no less empowering of a woman too, to get beyond the hero. It was so poignant for women to reach the point where there could be a feminine heroine. And the feminine heroine can rescue many women from being abused. The next step is to get beyond the heroine, and to get beyond the hero in all of us. When we're not heroic and open to each other, the problem of abuse takes on a completely different thing, because you don't start by pushing the other person around. You start by listening. And that's what Dr. Henderson was able to do in our Jung Institute, which, as I say, has survived as a psychological democracy. And it's only in our institute, of all the others, that psychological types was developed. Everybody else neglected psychological types. In some Jungian institutes, it wasn't even taught. And it was seen as something the MBTI did. It was seen as persona psychology. The only institute that really took the psychological types really seriously, consistently over the time, even though there were courses in other places, was our institute, first with Dr. Joseph Wilwright, then with myself, and that whole psychological democracy, where there are different points of view, helps us enormously to keep one heroic ideal, one monocular hero's journey, one imitation of Jung journey from dominating. So in that little culture that I know something about, I think I see something. Wouldn't it be wonderful if American culture could get beyond the hero and see its real place in the ecosystem of nations? I dream of that happening. I thought it was beginning to happen with Obama in the most exquisite way. And I think we've taken a tremendous regressive restoration of the heroic persona, but I don't think that's going to last. I think we're on the verge of realizing ourselves as a psychological democracy. If we achieve that, this whole problem, people pushing each other around to prove that they can be in control, will disappear. But only with difficulty, but still it's possible. That's my dream. That's part of the dream of this model I'm showing, that it's not just the hero archetype. That may be the least important of the archetypes, though we've made it the most. So I hope that helps. It does. It's an idealism that my extroverted intuition embraces, and I still believe it's possible.
Thank you, Dr. Beebe. Okay, next up is Jan, V, Maya, Jean Jung, Vincent, and Serena. Jan, go ahead.
Hi. I'm just asking about the inferior functions, and what I was wondering, I've heard that in order to individuate, one must pursue one's inferior function. And do you have an example of that kind of pursuit, and how does one intrinsically motivate oneself towards that end?
Well, and I think it's chapter 3 of my book, Energies and Patterns in Psychological Type. I talk about that dream that I mentioned of having a Chinese laundress in my dream. And perhaps if I just shared the dream with you briefly again, it happened that before I worked with Dr. Henderson, I worked for about 2.5 years with a wonderful woman Jungian analyst named Elizabeth Osterman, who was certainly good at helping me pay attention to the feminine side of myself. And there were some things that were not so healthy in my early 30s. I would see I was having migraine headaches, and I was seeing whole patterns of vegetation that looked like they were like tundra that had gotten too much ice and that were poorly developed, and they did seem to be in bad shape. And Dr. Osterman rightly connected those, and she said it in these words, she was also a physician, to the vegetative nervous system. And she felt that that part of me was not happy, that I was really too controlling, too compulsive, too in a way, too male. And I was having images of the masculine being more powerful than the feminine in ways that were not so good. And so I really knew that I needed to do something about my feminine side, but if I could only find my feminine side. And then came the dream of the Chinese laundress. Now, what the situation, this particular woman that I chose was an actual woman who ran a Chinese laundry, and she was a survivor. Her family had been wealthy in China, and she was a survivor of the rape of Nanking. And so she had probably a kind of sadness and bitterness. She also had a certain anger that you could see at her husband. And in my dream, she was sitting in a room alone. She didn't have anything. There was hardly any furniture, and it was because her husband in the dream was also Chinese in the dream, but her husband would he would take the money that he had, and rather than give it to her so that there could be furniture in the home, that kind of thing, he would go out and spend it gambling and drinking and doping, and so there would be no money, so that she was sitting in a room alone with nothing. Now that was quite a dream for me to have, and it really was the dream that changed my life, I think. Now, in associating to the dream, we can only do what we can do with the apparatus that we have. I could realize in her lack of adornment and lack of extroverted sensation, appurtenances, including the way she, in real life, and didn't dressed very simply and did not use makeup and try to make herself in any way. She folded clothes, but she didn't wear clothes of any interest. I could easily see her as an introverted sensation type in whom extroverted sensation was not developed. So my analyst said, well, you know, it seems the point of the dream is she doesn't have anything. And so as I thought about why she didn't have anything, and what the dream said was the husband was spending all the money. Well, what part of me was like that? This is how I associated to the dream at the time. I said, what part of me is like that? And I said, well, the part of me that's like that is my extroverted intuition was, especially in those days, I loved movies, I loved art. So for me to read about something in the newspaper and hear that an art show had opened or a movie had opened would mean that I just had to see it that night. So I would be, or a book, I would run everything, nothing, we didn't have the internet then. You couldn't go home and just order things. So I would hurry across town, hardly having any dinner, try to go to a bookstore before it closed at 9 p.m. to get the latest book, or I would go to this movie lest it would close, or I'd go to this art show. And basically I was always running around pursuing extroverted, intuitive ways of extending my life with things that I would find interesting. And in that way, I was like the man in the dream, doping and drinking and gambling. Even though I did none of those things, I was rather reckless in the way I spent my libido, and no wonder, in a sense, I was often tired and often in the fatigue would be getting these headaches. So I realized that I wasn't taking good enough care of sensation. Were I to interpret the dream today, I would interpret it differently. I would see more of that man's as demonic extroverted sensation. But back then I didn't have that concept. Then I could see the shadow side of my extroverted intuition, and that's about as far as I could get. So, but I thought there's more to it than that, because it's introverted sensation. I realized that. So I thought to myself, what is introverted sensation? What is introverted sensation? And I began to think, it's sensation on the inside of the body. And it involves things like your digestion and your breathing and things in the autonomic vegetative nervous system. And so I began to think about that. And I began to watch myself as not what I did after my working day was over, but during my working day. And what I discovered was that I was sitting in my office listening to my patients, and I was such a true believer in Jungian psychology, and I was reading all these books of Jung and von Franz and Hillman and all these stars of the Jungian world, Edinger, and so I was so excited that every time a patient told me a dream with my extroversion, intuition, I didn't want to disturb the dream in any way, so I would be listening with bated breath, which means that if I was holding my breath in check, I was just breathlessly trying to hear the dream image and then associate it to the archetype as I could with my extroverted intuition and introverted thinking and my extensive reading. And I was just so captured by the emergent possibilities of everybody else's unconscious that I wasn't even allowing myself to breathe. And so I thought to myself, well, God, no wonder I get a headache every night, because I'm building up this enormous oxygen debt and I'm poisoning myself with carbon dioxide. So I thought to myself, did go to medical school after all. So I thought, what would happen if while I'm listening to people, instead of just listening to the next chance to make an association at an intuitive thinking level, I made room for myself, and I literally allowed myself to breathe. So for a long time, then after that, or at least for the first few weeks after that, I would make rather loud breathing sounds while I was listening to my patients, and people would comment on that, but I didn't care. I knew I had to give myself room to breathe and so forth. And the interesting thing was there was a follow-up dream. The same woman looked happy. Her husband was treating her better now, and he was taking her out for ice cream. And she had a smile on her face. So I was clearly getting somewhere by listening to the inside of my body. And of course, where I got as a therapist is anyone who's done therapy or been in therapy would understand that the top of my head, my extroverted intuition and introverted thinking, and what I could read of von Franz and Jung and Edinger and Hillman that would tell me how to make interpret archetypes and all the rest, wasn't nearly as important as the internal bodily clues I got to not to what the patient was saying, but what they weren't saying. And the tensions I was feeling in my body was me picking up the unexpressed feelings people were having a harder time talking about that were not necessarily directly released in their dreams. So the introverted sensation opening up enabled me to identify those nonverbal things that analysts really have to listen to, and non-imaged things that actually help people more by getting below the surface of the narrative to where the emotions are and what people are feeling, so that I actually became an infinitely better therapist also. So I hope all of that suggests and what the anima development would be like, and how much it changed my life from a heroic mode of doing psychotherapy to a much more receptive and open and a much better person to have as your analyst. And that, I hope, tells you an example of what it really means to develop the inferior function and find that it's useful.
Thank you, Dr. Beebe. So the next question is from Wesley from Singapore. He requests that I ask the question in his place. And I'm going to combine it with something that we've talked about before. So this is a question for Richard first, and then to Dr. Beebe. So Wesley is talking about the Chinese way of looking at things. And we've talked about both, Richard has worked a lot with I Ching, and Dr. Beebe also mentioned that. And it looks like that the Chinese way of thinking deals with kind of the balance of different forces far more naturally and far more integrally than the Western way of thinking. So could you comment on that, of kind of achieving the balance seems to be easier in the Chinese way of thinking about archetypes, way about thinking, the part of the culture, whichever way you want to put it. So Richard, and then John.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, people talk about Eastern and Western ways of looking at things, but I mean, it's not the current Eastern way or Chinese way of looking at things now. Obviously, it's the ancient way that they had. A lot of that culture got destroyed in the Cultural Revolution. There's different, like apparently even now, there's political curbs on actually using some of these ancient practices and so on. So I would say that there's very much the opposites at work, in their philosophy at its very heart. And the idea of that complementary kind of systems interaction, and the idea that Tao finds this path between these things, and that is the natural balance of expression. So I think that, they say, probably the ancient Chinese way. It was quite an introverted, intuitive way of looking at the world. You know, some people have spoken about how potentially the sort of ancient typology of their culture was perhaps an INFJ culture. You know, the sort of introverted, intuitive with extroverted feeling. It was very collective culture in a social sense. You know, it was all about the us, the social group. You know, and and it still is today. I mean, to a lot of degree, the focus of the collective. So yeah, I mean, I think it's inevitable that introverted intuition, and someone else in the chat does John think that Jung's type was INTJ? I think that is what he proposes in his book, and he uses quite good arguments about that in taken from the Red Book and the archetypes in it. So yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of part of the course with, well, certainly from my experience, my introverted intuition. You know, seeing things in that systemic sort of way of balances and yeah, that way of the wholeness and integrating things and synthesizing things into a whole is all kind of the Tao and the introverted intuition. I think they're probably linked in some way, in the way that they come about.
Sorry, does George or Skip want to add anything to kind of, you know, any comments about kind of the Chinese way of dealing with the opposites and integration of the opposites and achievement of some kind of balance in personality?
The Western way is to try to do it through rationalism, and think it makes you think you can do it with the textbook, and you can, all I have to do is learn these 8 functions and just keep them in balance and everything will be hunky-dory. And it just doesn't work that way. It works through experience, and that's what the Chinese learned and have known for 5,000 years. Indians too.
George, would you like to add anything? Okay, John, would you like to comment?
Well, yeah, of course, I love the I Ching, and those of you who know my earlier book, Integrity and Depth, has right on the cover an image of a term from one of the quintessential texts of ancient Chinese philosophy that is probably more translated than any book. That almost every month there's a new translation of it. It's called the Tao Te Ching. And the word Tao is certainly in it. It is this idea of a sort of underlying path that could be compared to the yellow brick road that the journeyers in Oz are supposed to follow to get to the wizard. But in this book, Integrity and Depth, I take on the idea of integrity, which is a word that was coined by Cicero, presumably, taking an earlier Latin noun, integritas, which is where we get the word in whole, but the idea of, he took the word integer, which meant entire or whole, and he turned it into integritas, which we translate as integrity. Cicero turned it into integritas. We owe Cicero terms like quantity, quality, integrity. He had a way of taking things that had been adjectives and turning them into nouns and qualities. And his work was very important in helping us see integrity, something like our justice system, as a balance of duties. But this was a great development in the West, but it was not equal to what had been done earlier than him by at least 300 or 400 years by Lao Tzu, who introduced the idea that actually that word seems to have traveled into the word that became integrity. The word is de, D-E, that T-E apparently passed its way along the Silk Route all the way to Rome, and actually had a role in the evolution of the term integer, which we take as meaning whole and entirety. And then finally integrity, which is how we balance the needs of the self against the needs of the whole, according to Cicero. In China, it's much more, it's only in the late 20th century that we began to have a philosopher like Emmanuel Levinas in France, who said that we all have in ourselves an infinite obligation to the other. We can't just make it finite. It's not something that we balance needs against each other as in a judicial hearing. We actually are always responsible to discerning what's going on in the world, what its Tao is, and as intelligently as possible, move with nature, which is moving according to nature's laws, as for example now in one of nature's violent compensations. Lao Tzu would say this is the moment when we have to use the de, which is the integrity that consists of several things. So I'm holding this book up because with the hope that you can see the Chinese character has many separate elements. Over here, where I put my finger, is the image of a man walking or a person walking. And over here, underneath it, is the image of a human heart. And up here is the image of an eye with a line on it that suggests that the eye is looking outward. Now that means that our integrity is three different things. We have to walk in accord with what the heart feels and the eye sees looking outward. So we have to be able to discern the situation we're in, because there we can see the movement of the Tao. We also have to look at how we feel about it, and then we have to walk in accord with it. Now, it's not just to one's own self being true. When Ezra Pound, who notoriously ended up in a terrible situation of giving fascist diatribes on Italian radio during World War II, and was saved from being committed of treason by being declared insane, a great poet, he worked with this same image, but he did translations, but he didn't understand the meaning of the line on the eye, that the eye is looking outward. So he thought it meant moving in accord with what the eye sees looking into the heart. Well, that's much too introverted feeling. That's much too introverted. It doubles it. The heart, the introverted feeling is important. And the walking, the extroverted sensation behavior, or the extroverted thinking plan is important. But all important is that eye looking outward and accurately discerning the situation. We have nothing like this in the West because we're just not taught discernment. So nowadays at Harvard University, the most popular course at Harvard right now is Chinese philosophy. And even when I go back to China, because I've studied the I Ching for years, they were so glad to have me lecture because I was bringing back the traditions the Cultural Revolution had destroyed. And if we could get back this image, this complex image, that when you find yourself in a situation, you've got to actually figure out what it is, and it has its own dynamic. Then how you feel about it, and then how you want to behave in accord with it. That triad of discernment and also introverted feeling and also the extroverted thinking, extroverted sensation behavior, that works. But in the West, we tend to fragment these things. We don't make them a unity. And that's the achievement that somehow the introverted intuitive geniuses of China, particularly Lao Tzu, was able to get, and also Confucius. So I want to kind of take us back to a sense that our consciousness in these matters is incomplete, and it shows. Jung says that which a person can't make conscious happens to them as fate. We're having this fate now because there's something we're not being conscious of. And I think we haven't been looking at the situation clearly enough. That's why the climate is in such crisis. So, and why this particular thing is a kind of prequel to dealing with the climate crisis, I think, a lot more intelligently than we have been dealing with the coronavirus crisis. We may learn how inadequate we are, and that would be the beginning of learning how we need to learn discernment. And I think our types will help us.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. So the last three questions are from Jean Jung, Vincent, and Joseph. Jean Jung, go ahead.
Hi. So I'm finding the coronavirus to be, the situation to be really a powerful symbol for where we are at globally in terms of our own hero's journey.
Yes.
And especially as an Asian American woman,
Yes.
I really feel the importance of the global integration that needs to happen. The Tao talks about the world starting out as undifferentiated energy and splitting off into yin and the yang energy developing to its utmost point, the idea of the overactive warrior archetype, and that it would only be at a point where it almost destroy itself and the rest of the world before it would come back to support the yin. So I'm interested in this awareness of culture, East and West, and the problem, like the fact that it came from China just raises so much in, many people. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about how we can apply maybe the hero's journey, the archetypes, to looking at the situation in a more solution-oriented way.
Okay. Does anybody want to deal with it? We've talked about this in multiple. Skip, go ahead. Skip, you're muted.
Okay, one fundamental thing we're missing here, and that is how the left brain and the right brain works.
Sure.
And in the early 1970s, there was a Japanese man who had a stroke, and he lost the use of his right brain. And when he came out of it and started to recover, he found that he could read kana characters, that's the syllabary character of Japanese language, but he could not read the Chinese characters anymore, the kanji. And the kanji are pictographs, whereas the kana is very rational oriented and like Western writing. And so here's an example of how differently we think. This character in Japanese is otoko. It means man. And in this character, the top is a rice field and the bottom is strength. So strength in a rice field means man. But for Western audiences, Western people, 90% of the time see this man as going to the right, while Eastern people see him as going to the left. It's a completely different perspective. And so the Eastern way of seeing things is by imagery, as we talk about in Jungian psychology, and it isn't by rationality as we use in Plato. And so what we need to do is, in order to have balance, we need both.
Thank you. Let's go to the next question. That's going to be by Joseph. Joseph, go ahead.
Yes. Does understanding the dichotomy of control along with humility allow one to move past the hero archetype and mature? And then also, I understand that it would be unreasonable to speak with any kind of, ask you to speak with any kind of certainty. How important is it one's age and environment in selecting the next archetype? Because I know you can't say for sure one way or the other, but I wouldn't ask that. But I would ask, at different points in our lives, we're more capable of moving than others.
Well, I think you're asking me this question, aren't you? Is that right?
Yes, yeah, but yeah, feel free.
You're asking me this question. Well, let me just start by saying what a young country America is. And so I hope I won't offend us who, as a lifelong American, by pointing out how incredibly adolescent our society tends to be, how caught up it is in, for instance, right now when we think we have achieved so much, how much politics turns out to be identity politics. And of course, ego identity, according to Erik Erikson, is something that should be formed between age 12 and 16. So it seems to me that there's a lot of ways in which our country keeps behaving and making decisions like a smart 16-year-old, I mean, that's the feeling that I get. And it seems like these people, who crowd into the bar in Wisconsin delighted that there was bars open again. I mean, people who don't wear masks, the president of the United States who's constantly boasting, I mean, et cetera, and lying and all this. It just feels, citizens arrests that you think you've got someone and you try to trap them, and then if they resist your citizen's arrest, you can kill them, I mean, this is an adolescent out of control. To me, it's a 16-year-old heroic attitude that has its own identity and thinks that its ability to both have an identity and identify the shadow in someone else is some kind of great achievement. So I guess we have to accept that a young country would still have a very immature psychology, and we might as well admit how immature we are and begin to say that there's only one cure for immaturity, and that's growing up. And growing up takes time. And so the only way we ever outgrow the hero is when it is through failure. I mean, this is why Jung had a role. One of his own patients created Alcoholics Anonymous, and it was a patient with one of the two founders, who were Bill W. and Roland H. And Roland H. Was a patient of Jung's, and he was drinking, and Jung finally said to him, I have been unable to help you. I have tried to initiate a spiritual experience thinking that would help you, and I have failed. And Jung's admission of failure became the first step in AA. Roland H. went to the Oxford Truth Society. He learned a great deal of the rest, but that admission of failure, that admission of defeat, that the great analyst admitted defeat before the alcoholism, which actually is usually rather poorly treated if the only treatment is individual psychotherapy, it's not a very good treatment of alcoholism. Individual psychotherapy for people in AA is a very good treatment, but the AA step, admitting one's powerless. So we have to we're almost like, we're sort of a drunken society. We're sort of an addictive society, we're overdeveloping the planet. We still talk about growing our economies as if that were the great thing to do. And of course, we tend to neglect people who really need better employment. I mean, I see exactly the population that was being neglected by the Democrats that before the election, George Packer was saying this, the New Yorker, and Hillary Clinton, et cetera, were not paying enough attention to what was happening to the people in the coal belt and other areas, about where they really were. And the solution of re-educating them and getting them to go to college was not going to make it. And that was exactly the group of people that became Trump's essential base, the people who felt that they had been the neglected ones, and that the liberals had neglected them. So of course I understand all that, but somehow or other, we're just going to have to see that we are more powerless to control outcomes than we think we are. And only that will get us past the inflation of ego identity, identity politics, which it can be just as obnoxious. It's obnoxious whether it's on the left or the right. It's just as offensive because it's so egoistic and so uncaring of the needs of the whole. And so unhumble also, so unhumble. So there's a lot of work to be done, but immaturity can be outgrown. I mean, at least we have an ego identity. Now, the next step is if we really believe in a democracy, we have to live up to it. And that often the way you outgrow ego identity is say, well, I seem to be this kind of person, and yet I'm having this kind of life. What would my life look like if I lived up to the values of the person? And oddly enough, that ego identity only realizes itself when it starts making room for the others, and really makes room for the others and makes room for everybody else's agency as well as one's own. But right now, we're embarrassingly immature. And if we can accept the shame that we're not as sophisticated as we keep telling ourselves we are, that would enormously improve things right there. There's no question that we have what it needs to take care of the planet. The planet would already respond to it if we would use the means at hand. But we're so busy asserting our identity that we can't seem to see all the places that are in trouble. So we have to move beyond that attitude, but I think we can. And I think we just enter a stage of facing the embarrassing immaturity. This has been, to me, I'm embarrassed right now by America. It's embarrassing to have the Lancet magazine tell us that we need a different president. That's embarrassing to me. I thought we had, as a doctor, I was proud of our medicine. So, but we're basically saying that our medical policy is bad. And that's pretty embarrassing for a country like ours. I'm willing to take the shame on. I think we need to learn to revalue shame. We need to be ashamed. And if we can be ashamed, the rest will take care of itself. Shame is the single greatest healer. And we've somehow assumed that we should be in the business of removing shame from people. Rather, I think, yes, we could get rid of toxic shame, but we don't have to get rid of shame itself.
As Carl Jung says, in the filth it will be found. So on that note, this has been a wonderful discussion. Now we're going to break up into small groups so we can continue, we can go, we can have a much greater back and forth. Dr. Beebe, it is an amazing honor. If you could, this is just great.